Straight talk from Israel. You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio.
Welcome to The Definitive Wrap, where we report the truth about the world around us. We stand for true conservative principles and against wokeness. The Definitive Wrap, where we respect people of faith, the men and women in uniform who serve with pride, and our support for Israel. And now, your hosts, Bela Sebro, she's the nice one, and Alan Skorsky. He's not so nice. But together, they are The Definitive Wrap.
Happy Wednesday, Israel News Talk Radio, and to our listening audience from whatever country you are listening from. If you missed us last week, you can catch our previous shows right here on Israel News Talk Radio or on our podcast at thedefinitivewrap.com. Following our last show, we received emails from many of you thanking us for bringing our perspective to this network, but wanted to know a little bit more about our political backgrounds. So, Bela, why don't you go first?
So a little bit about me. I'm a journalist by profession, and I author a weekly column for the Five Towns Jewish Times. My political media experience dates back to my heyday when I produced and hosted a cable TV show called Inside Israel. I've also had a few radio shows along the way. Also, I'm a very active member of various pro-Israel organizations, and it was during the pandemic last summer of 2020 when I had this brainstorm to do a political podcast. I wanted a co-host, and knowing Alan for like a gazillion years, I reached out to him about my idea, and the Definitive Wrap was created. Anyway, we never dreamed it would take off the way it did with thousands of listeners.
And a little bit about myself. I was the first pro-Israel activist at Wayne State University in Detroit, where I was up against a dozen pro-PLO Muslim and communist student organizations. And moving fast forward, I've worked with congressional candidates on their pro-Israel position papers and written 2 books, my last one being Israel Betrayed, How the Democrats, J Street, and the Jewish Left Have Undermined Israel. So, Bela, what's on tap for today's show?
Have you ever wondered how activists and media outlets can just lie and misrepresent the truth about Israel and their battle against terrorists who are always playing the victim card, claiming they are engaging in justified resistance? Today, we're going to be joined by Daniel Diker from the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs to tell us about his work uncovering the Soviet-style propaganda techniques employed by Jewish left-wing groups like J Street and Arab activists like Linda Sarsour, who was once deemed as irrelevant, who seek to delegitimize Israel, the lone democracy in the Middle East, while elevating the narrative of a mythical Arab state called Palestine. Stay tuned, and we will be right back.
The return of the Jewish people to the land of Israel was prophesied in the Bible thousands of years ago and is coming true today. Shalom. Join me, Josh Wander, on Israel Unplugged. Listen in as we delve into the spiritual and physical aspects of the Jewish return to Zion. We'll discuss the biblically mandated, historic, and of course practical understandings of this incredible transition from exile to redemption. That's Israel Unplugged, every Monday on IsraelNewsTalkRadio.com.
Welcome back to The Definitive Wrap with Alan Skorsky and Bela Sebro.
Welcome back, everyone, and let's begin. You know, there's an old adage, the truth will set you free. That is, unless the lies told about you are so big, so organized, and so well orchestrated that the truth doesn't even matter anymore. The rise of the blood libel movement against Israel has been growing for decades, but now has reached an all-time level of lies meant to delegitimize, destabilize, and eventually dismantle the state of Israel. From the media to academia to the halls of Congress, the slandering of Israel with the most grotesque lies have led to a record level of physical attacks and harassment of Jews on the streets of New York and other large cities with significant Jewish populations, and even further onto college campuses throughout North America. In the last 2 weeks, J Street and their allies released a false and very misleading poll suggesting that 25% of American Jews believe that Israel is an apartheid state. During this same period, groups like J Street and other anti-Israel Jewish leftists have come to the defense of Ben and Jerry's BDS attacks against Israel. Today's guest, Dan Diker of the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs, whom Bela will introduce shortly, issued a paper titled The Apartheid Poll and the Disinformation Discourse, which delves deeper into who, why, and how these lies against Israel have gained so much traction in America to the point of becoming mainstreamed. Bela?
Thank you, Alan. A lie does not become truth, wrong does not become right, and evil does not become good just because it is accepted even by a majority. For example, we are now in the year 2021. That is a fact. If a majority of people in specific groups were to decide, hey, it's really 1975, and never mind that you think it's 2021, and I don't care what you say to prove your point, it is really 1975. Does that make it the truth? The answer is no. We are in 2021, regardless of who decides to say and believe otherwise. And that is analogous to what we are dealing with here. We are dealing with people trying to make the victim appear as the aggressor. And there are times that who it is expected to be friends with the victim may feel, let's go with the opinion of the popular bully. That said, a survey shows that 25% of US Jewish voters, based on interviews with 800 Jewish voters, agree that Israel is an apartheid state. Here to discuss this inexplicable topic all the way from Israel is Dan Diker, who is a fellow and senior project director at the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs, where he heads the program to counter political warfare and BDS. He is editor and co-author of the JCPA's latest volume, Israelophobia and the West. Dan, welcome back again to the Definitive Wrap. Dan, you have authored numerous books on the global BDS campaign, and you are an expert on the topic of countering terrorism. Please explain to our audience that although we expect anti-Semites to say the worst about Jews, Zionists, and Israel, but when it's our own Jewish people who accuse Israel of genocide, one can say that's anti-Semitic. Would you not say that something is just not right here?
Well, Bela and Alan, thank you for having me on the program. This is a very important topic because it generates a lot of inherent and intuitive discomfort when we have a discussion within the Jewish family about statements and representations made by Jewish organizations and Jewish groups and individual Jews who are vociferous, outspoken, high profile, and make those representations that under the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, IHRA definition, are blatantly anti-Semitic. And that combination of Jewish people uttering statements that would be defined as political anti-Semitism is very troubling. But unfortunately, that the recent poll that was conducted by Jim Gerstein, and associated with strong progressive democratic operatives, really raises that question that you raised just a minute ago, and that is that if 25% of American Jews as polled hold that Israel is an apartheid state and 22% hold that Israel has committed genocidal acts against the Palestinians, we've got a problem not with Israel, for those people who are interested in facts, but we have a problem with those segments of the Jewish population in the United States that would actually submit to that type of disinformation. It is a rank anti-Semitic declaration to say that Israel is an apartheid state, because it singles out the nation state of the Jewish people, a vibrant democratic state, and to compare it either to Nazi Germany by implication, by saying it commits acts of genocide, or to compare it somehow through a racial, the racializing notion of the former apartheid South African regime is simply absurd to anybody that's taken a fifth grade course on Israel, and the Middle East. But in front of our very eyes, this phenomenon is taking place, and it ought concern Jews everywhere.
So, Dan, there are so many points that you brought up. One, we have the Jews on the left. You mentioned J Street, who's got a real fixation on Israel. You have people like Peter Beinart, who wrote in his book, The Crisis of Zionism, which I wrote about in my book, Israel Betrayed, where he compares Israel to Nazi Germany. He says that while American Jews build Holocaust museums, we haven't learned the lessons of the Holocaust. So that's one enemy. But then we have the Free Palestine movement, or I call them the Palestinianists, people like Linda Sarsour and the Squad, who keep repeating the same lies over and over again. It is not an accident or a coincidence that they are using words like apartheid, which is supposed to remind us of South Africa, genocide, which is supposed to remind us of Rwanda, ethnic cleansing, which is supposed to remind us of Serbia and Bosnia. So these are very, very calculated words that they stay on script. And unfortunately, now it is becoming mainstream in America. And we're not doing anything about it. And this is a much bigger fight that we have ignored for too long because we thought, who's going to believe these crazy lies?
Well, you know, Alan, where all of these examples that you've just brought up, which are the low-hanging fruit in the blood libel discourse that we are witnessing before our very eyes, to say Israel is genocidal or Israel's apartheid, for anybody, as we said, who knows anything, we know that that's, it's patently absurd. However, if you just walk it back to the source of that type of representation, the concept, the fictitious concept of illegal occupation or occupation, those words, which and the terms which have been completely twisted out of any kind of factual or legal context, where remember that word occupation, the historical context when people use that with Israel is usually not the former Nazi regime of Germany, former Nazi Germany that occupied much of the European continent. And that is the frame of reference that people have used this term completely incorrectly since 1967. And I think that has been the overlooked phenomenon. And I think it's even more dangerous because the word occupation seems far less dangerous, far less controversial than the lower hanging fruit, what I call the blood libel language of genocide and apartheid. But in fact, if those people that use apartheid, that use occupation and related to Israel, the occupiers since 1967 have done so in many cases, I think maliciously. Certainly those in the Palestinian leadership that they have used that type of language, by the way, since the 1920s, when Hajj al-Amin al-Husseini, the first Palestinian religious and nationalist leader, said that Israel was endangering Al-Aqsa. This is well before Israel was even founded. That Israel is an occupier of the holy sites, the Muslim holy sites in Jerusalem. And then fast forward to 1967, when in Hebrew the word occupier, kovesh, means conqueror. It doesn't mean occupation in the frame of reference that the English word occupation means. But in fact, people are mostly either willingly, blindly, or naively, stupidly, basically invoking the Nazi occupation of sovereign Europe. And that is not at all the case, of course, with Israel. But that type of illegitimate use of what is a legitimate term of art in international legal terminology is really how we devolved into this lower-hanging blood libel language discourse.
Dan, I used to host a Manhattan cable TV show back in the 1980s. And prior to one of the interviews, I watched a documentary of a camp where Palestinian children were trained to be desensitized. And one of the methods used was tearing live chickens apart. Dan, anti-Zionism is spread through American college campuses and all social media platforms where intelligent and educated people are buying into this disinformation discourse. You talk about a political warfare phenomenon whose historical roots are based on tactics employed by the former Soviet Union, codenamed infection. Can you tell us about that?
As an introduction to this great case study of Soviet disinformation that targeted the United States successfully, let me just say, Bela, that the insensitivity when we use the word anti-Zionism is to what the real problem is, which is really Jew hatred. Because Jew hatred can be individual Jew hatred, meaning hatred against individual Jews, which we are seeing very broadly on university campuses across North America. And the main culprit, the main organization that's driving a lot of this Jew hatred is an organization called Students for Justice in Palestine.
Dan, we're coming up on a hard break. Hold that thought and we'll be right back.
Hi, everyone. This is Andrea Simento from Jerusalem, inviting you to drop everything and join me on my show, Pull Up a Chair. We'll visit this week's quirky stories, meet fabulous guests, and discover my Israel. Together, we'll laugh, shout, and explain the topics that make us say, hey, we've got to talk about that. So get comfortable and pull up a chair with me, Andrea Simento, every Thursday on Israel News Talk Radio.
Welcome back to The Definitive Wrap with Alan Skorsky and Bela Sebro.
Welcome back, everyone. Just before the break, you were telling us about Students for Justice in Palestine. Please continue.
Which was founded and is currently powered by Professor Hatem Bazian, who is a mid-level Hamas affiliate whose former organization, American Muslims for Palestine, was closed down by the by the Department of the Treasury for terrorism financing violations. And he founded this organization in 2002, and then powered it up over the coming years. And then in the last 7 or 8 years, the National Division of Students of Justice of Palestine was founded. This is an organization that adopts the Hamas line, and not even the PLO-Palestinian Authority line. They're too liberal for them, but they adopt the Hamas view, which is that basically the Jewish state should be destroyed, dismantled. That is also a PLO view, by the way, but their sympathies lie with the Hamas, and they are rank anti-Semites. We see on the campuses across North America, over 200 campuses, where Students for Justice in Palestine are, tearing through all of those campuses and forcing a lot of Jews to hide under their beds. That with Israel in the center, they are intimidating Jews, assaulting Jews, harassing Jews, and creating a very unpleasant state of affairs for Jewish students across the United States. So that's not anti-Zionism per se. It's anti-Semitism in the collective sense, as the Jewish nation's only home is the nation state of the Jewish people, so that's Israel. So we really should be talking in terms of Jew hatred, collective anti-Semitism, or as Professor Bernard Lewis of blessed memory used to say, when he used to come to Israel for 5 months a year, political anti-Semitism. That's what we are talking about today. And in that sense, Peter Beinart is an advocate for political anti-Semitism. And Jeremy Ben-Ami was a former schoolmate of mine at the collegiate school. While he calls himself pro-Israel, pro-peace, his actions prove the exact opposite, that he is actually supporting the delegitimizing and defamation activities of the Palestinian leadership, and all of his actions are actually very anti-Israel. And with this, I'll end. The latest example, you too may know that in the last 24 hours, 90 members of Knesset, 90 of 120 members of Knesset, signed a petition that called on Ben & Jerry's to reverse their discriminatory boycott, and therefore Jeremy Ben-Ami, by issuing support for the Ben & Jerry's boycott and the delegitimization movement, is essentially colliding with the vast majority of elected Israeli representatives in the Israeli Knesset. Now, either of you can help me understand on what basis Jeremy Ben-Ami is pro-Israel, I will give you a lifetime supply of cookies and cream.
Okay, so I'll tell you a few things. Number one, from the get-go, when Jeremy Ben-Ami first launched J Street, I said immediately he's an anti-Israel organization. He's not a more liberal version of AIPAC. And I had a lot of blowback, and I said, no, this is an anti-Israel organization. And in his book, Allies, written by Michael Oren, I think it's the right name of his book, he wrote about how he came across a member of J Street and asked him, why did you join? And his answer was, because I was too uncomfortable with the pro-Israel stance of the previous administration, which was the Bush administration. So J Street came into being under the Obama administration. Now, in your paper,
at the same time,
yeah, go ahead. No, go ahead.
No, I just wanted to make one comment, and that is that as the former Secretary General of the World Jewish Congress, which is the largest Jewish diplomatic organization in the world, over 100, we represent the official Jewish communities in over 100 countries across 6 continents. And Ambassador Ronald Lauder, who has taken a very strong position against the anti-Semitism in Congress, he just wrote a full-page open letter to President Biden. On the first day in that role, it was made very clear to me that the World Jewish Congress supports the sitting democratically elected government in Israel, whether that is Prime Minister Bennett, Prime Minister Netanyahu, whether it's Prime Minister Olmert, Prime Minister Rabin of blessed memory, whoever the Prime Minister is. A Street has taken a very different view of their right as a Washington-based recruiting agency for young Jews to join the left flank of the Democratic Party by ignoring blind support or unconditional support for the sitting government in Israel. We may notice the extraordinary development where Jeremy Ben-Ami has now collided with the unequivocal condemnation of Israel's President Herzog, who was the chairman of the Labor Party for many years and a stalwart of the Labor Party, who called Ben and Jerry's actions the new economic terrorism, of our foreign minister, Mr. Lapid, who comes from the center-left party. So Jeremy Ben-Ami, who claimed that he was really just anti-Netanyahu, has now proved his true colors. He really is anti-Israel because he does not respect the democratic choice of the vast majority of Israelis, whom today have voted in an Arab faction for the first time called the Arab list under Dr. Mansour Abbas, as well as the Labor Party and Merit and Yesh Atid, There Is a Future, as well as 2 right-wing parties. So this is the broadest, most pluralistic government in almost 3 decades. And still, Jeremy Ben-Ami is butting heads with the elected representatives of the Israeli parliament, of the elected representatives of the Israeli government. So he really has to stand up and come clean and answer the question, how can you prove that you are not completely anti-Israel, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week?
Dan, how can we use the method of disinformation to counteract the disinformation prevalent amongst those who buy into the demonization of Israel? In other words, what can be done to turn it around the other way?
So, Bela, let me just go by, because I went off on this, let's out Jeremy Ben-Ami for a few minutes. Let me just go back to your original question before the what can be done as to what is wrong. And you brought up the great example that I wrote about together with Dr. Yechiel Leiter in our recent piece on the what we call the apartheid poll and the disinformation discourse, which any of your viewers can find at jcpa.org. This has really made the rounds. It apparently has hit a chord and has been redistributed and republished by 4 or 5 different papers and periodicals in the last week. And what has happened here is that we have revealed what many people have been thinking about for some years, but haven't either written about or it hasn't really penetrated the mainstream discourse, which is that, there is political criticism, a legitimate political critique of Israel, as there is of any country. And then there is political anti-Semitism. When people call Israel an apartheid or genocidal or ethnic cleanser or racist country, this is just rank anti-Semitism. This is anti-Semitic name calling. This is not political critique. Political critique would be to strip away any kind of hyperbole, any kind of rhetorical assault, and begin to analyze what it is about Israeli policy that they disagree with. They might disagree with the policy of allowing Jews to build housing starts east of the 67 lines. They might insist that Israel return the Golan Heights to Iran-backed Syria, or they might insist that Israel not counterattack against Iran-backed Hamas in the Gaza Strip. But they have to focus on a non-hyperbolic policy issue that they then should compare and contrast to other places in the world. Just as one example, and then we'll go on to what can be done. If you look at Russia today, and Russia clearly penetrated and unilaterally took over Crimea. No one refers to Russia as an apartheid genocidal state. The Republic of Turkey, under the neo-Ottoman government of Mr. Erdogan, unilaterally took over northern Cyprus. No one, and by the way, and they shut down and imprisoned and tortured members of the media and members of the judiciary, and they created a trumped-up conspiracy charge a few years ago in order for Mr. Erdogan to come out victorious again in the election. No one called Turkey an apartheid or genocidal state. And then, of course, you have Morocco, which still occupies Western Sahara. Nobody called them an apartheid state. So you have to have what financial people would call comparables whenever you analyze any set of numbers or set of political criteria. And with the situation in Israel, people simply don't do that. They simply engage in wholesale rank Jew hatred name calling, and that is absolutely a non-starter. So that is the type of rhetorical and ideological assault that Israel is facing, and it is nothing short of an ideological assault. It has nothing to do with political criticism.
Right. Dan, in your paper, you referenced the hijacking of George Floyd. He was, the black gentleman who was arrested by police, and he was very mistreated until one of the policemen actually killed him. Immediately, Linda Sarsour and her movement created a link between Israel and American police. There were murals drawn with George Floyd with a keffiyeh around his neck. And then you had Linda Sarsour and her movement saying that American police are taught by the IDF how to mistreat and abuse blacks in America. Can you talk about your research into that aspect for your paper? Dan, the music is coming on, so please hold that thought. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back.
Are you interested in transforming your life, drawing closer to the Creator, and uncovering the deeper meanings and hidden treasures in the Hebrew Bible?
Then join me, Rav Yitzhak Michelson,
And me, William Hall,
on the Science of Kabbalah, where we are seeking to narrow the gap between what we understand of our physical and spiritual worlds. So make sure to tune in every Tuesday at 5 p.m. Israel time, 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, here on Israel News Talk Radio.
Hello, I am Walter Bingham. If you want to hear the news behind the news and the true perspective on world affairs, then the Walter Bingham File is the program for you. We bring you interviews with the movers and shakers, political commentaries, and on-the-spot reports of events as they happen. All here every Tuesday, 4 p.m. Israel time, 9 a.m. Eastern time. And it's all archived on our website. Make it a date.
We're back with Alan and Bela on the Definitive Rap Radio Show.
And we're back with our very special guest, Daniel Diker, fellow at the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs. Dan, before the break, we were about to talk about the racialization of anti-Semitism as so skillfully employed by Linda Sarsour and the Hamas squad. But it really goes much deeper. We know that the Sarsour agenda is to hijack those causes and make common cause with other so-called aggrieved groups. One of those groups in America is called Black Lives Matter. which or who are very entrenched within the Democratic Party. They have used the killing of George Floyd to justify rioting, looting, and violence in big cities across America. And with that alliance, we now see Black Lives Matter rallies where they compare the plight of the so-called Palestinians with the cause of anti-Black racism. Now, I know that you have not done, your paper does not involve Black Lives Matter, but it does talk about how Linda Sarsour has hijacked that movement to integrate it into her cause of legitimizing the so-called Palestinian cause. So please continue from where we left off.
Yeah, well, this is the Linda Sarsour, is a pro-jihadist, a Soviet propagandist, and her view is that Israel is a white supremacist country, even though the three of us know the majority of Israelis, including my wife and children, come from brown Middle Eastern roots. So the majority of Israel is a brown country. We're not a white country. But what you pointed to, Alan, is what I call the racialization of the Israel-Palestinian territorial conflict. And the George Floyd tragedy, the tragic killing of Mr. Floyd, was used with malice aforethought by the jihad squad, whether it was Ilhan Omar, who is a Hamas sympathizer, or Linda Sarsour, who is an advocate the problem in Israel, whose only solution, according to Mark Lamont Hill, the former terminated CNN commentator who's a professor somehow at Temple University, is to end Israel's existence. That's the only way to solve a problem that has been likened to the racial injustice that was, or the injustice certainly, police brutality that was done to Mr. Floyd. Now, what has happened in this terrible act of Soviet propaganda that Mrs. Sarsour has advocated tragically for herself, but it's probably good for her book sales, is that she accused Israel of training police in these anti-terror techniques, which doesn't happen. The police don't do that. There were meetings on intelligence issues only between members of different police departments across the United States and the Israeli security agencies on the level of intelligence, because Israel is very good at intelligence gathering. The only thing that Israel has not done well in terms of intelligence is to advance its own side of the story, the facts and historical context when it is being assaulted the way Mrs. Sarsour is very good at assaulting Israel, and as well as her fellow travelers. So racialization is the problem. We're no longer in a territorial conflict when we discuss Israel in the United States, and this poses a major challenge to Jewish organizations that are going to have to turn around to these, to these rhetorical jihadists and say, "Hey, enough is enough. We're not going to put up with this."
Dan, it's mind-boggling how, on one hand, anti-Zionist extremists denied the Holocaust. Yet on the other hand, there are those, or even the same people, depending on the day of the week, who will say that Zionists assisted Hitler. In fact, Mahmoud Abbas' central thesis of his book wrote about the secret relationship between Zionism and Israel. So in essence, he doesn't deny the Holocaust. He blames Zionism to facilitate Jewish emigration. Can you discuss that with us, please?
Sure. I mean, that was, first of all, let's remember that Cambridge University did some serious research. And as a matter of fact, two Israeli researchers, Gidon Remez and his colleagues, actually, you can find this out on Google, uncovered the original documents proving that Mahmoud Abbas was a Soviet agent based in the early 1980s in Syria. It's come to my attention through a very well-respected Sovietologist who works at the Wilson Center in Washington, D.C. It could very well be, according to this analyst, that the KGB actually wrote the doctoral thesis in Russian for Mahmoud Abbas, and then he had it translated into Arabic. We know that Patrice Lumumba University in Moscow, which has in the last several years been closed down, but that was founded as a university for active measures, for Soviet disinformation. We know that from a number of Soviet KGB defectors who come to the United States and have testified to that fact. So, Mahmoud Abbas and Arafat before him, they were training in Moscow, in Cuba, in Lebanon, and North Vietnam, North Korea. We had all these intelligence and Soviet disinformation training sessions for PLO leaders over the last 50 years. So it should not come as a surprise that the type of disinformation that we're seeing that's being driven out of Ramallah and today as well out of Gaza, because they have adopted through their Iranian sponsors the same in Gaza, the Hamas, the same type of political warfare PLO has been prosecuting for decades. And that is really where all of this comes from. And it is extraordinary how the West has eaten this, sort of taken this hook, line, and sinker. And as the recent polls of the Jewish Electoral Institute shows, and that just as a testimony to how serious things have become. But this has basically been a Soviet technique since the founding of the PLO in 1964, and the Soviets really turned against Israel in the early 1970s, as you remember after the Doctors Plot. But and this is strange because the Soviet Union had voted in favor of a Jewish state in November 29, 1947, when the UN Special Committee on Palestine recommended the creation of an Arab state and a Jewish state. And then when the vote came in 1948, the Soviet Union voted in favor of Israel, but then turned against us. And they saw that they had a really good puppet in the PLO.
Yeah. Dan, we have a little bit of time left. So I want to ask you a question based on your paper about countering this. Now, I know about groups like yours. We are good friends with Itamar Marcus from Palestinian Media Watch. And for someone like me, I would think that your organization and his organization is all we need to counter the lies, because you document everything to expose them. And yet we're losing the battle. Here in America, we've got a dozen different Jewish groups, but we're never on message. Whereas the jihadist movement, they're always on message. It's always free Palestine. It's always apartheid. As you mentioned earlier, Students for Justice in Palestine on every college campus. They are always united on one message. Whereas we Jews can never stick to one message, and we always have to look at things from a philosophical point, almost like we're learning Gemara. There's this side, there's that side. Is anti-Zionism, anti-Semitism, blah, blah, blah. At the end of the day, if you had to construct how we fight back, and not bringing a squirt gun to a cannon fight, what would you recommend is how we Jews must come up with one message and how we proceed and how we fight back in Congress, where now the squad has become mainstreamed?
Well, there are three elements to the overall strategy, Alan. One element is that we have many other allies outside the Jewish community whose positions are very similar to the ones that we've stated on this program. The Black American community, Pastor Dumasani Washington, who is a scholar, who is the president of the Institute for Black Solidarity with Israel. He's in touch with, thousands of pastors, African American pastors across the United States, and he's committed to telling the truth and exposing the lies of the PLO, the Hamas, their fellow travelers in the United States that are penetrating the Black community, Black American community, and other communities throughout the country. What we need is what we call our non-Jewish ambassadors and brothers and sisters, as in the Black American community, the Hispanic community, the Asian community, and there are millions of Americans that need to be coalesced because they're naturally, intuitively, and even educationally with us. They understand the truth, but we haven't done a great job in mobilizing non-Jews into this fight to isolate the rhetorical assaulters. Number one. Number two, Israel's got to play a much larger role, because Israel is the anchor of the message. It's not enough for NGOs to be advancing the message. Israel has to advance the message. So you folks have to put pressure on the Israeli government to help you as official. And number three, we have to out and reveal and expose all the time the lies. Go on the offense. There's no more defense. We're not talking about Hasbara. We're not talking about public diplomacy. This is, as Clausewitz says, war by other means. This is politics, war by other means, and war is politics by other means. And we have to engage in a wholesale frontal assault against those that are trying to dismantle the Jewish people and their one and only mini Jewish nation state.
Dan Diker, once again, we can't thank you enough for your time and expertise in combating and exposing the politicization and racialization of anti-Semitism. We urge all of our listeners to follow Dan and the work of the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs at jcpa.org. We also want to thank Tamar Yona, Israel News Talk Radio, and most of all, you, our audience. You can listen to all of our earlier shows at thedefinitivewrap.com or on this very network. On behalf of Bela and myself, I want to wish all of you a great rest of the week and a wonderful and restful Shabbos.
If you love Israel News Talk Radio, then you'll love our Facebook page. We keep you up to date on what's happening in Israel, plus little surprise treasures that we don't share on the radio. Go now to follow us on Facebook. Just look for the Israel News Talk Radio Facebook page, and don't forget to subscribe and follow us by clicking on the like button. We post great stuff there that you'll want to share. Israel News Talk Radio on Facebook and Israel News Radio on Twitter.
If you're hearing this message, everyone else can too. Advertise with Israel News Talk Radio and get your message out to people. We'll build a personalized package for you. Contact advertising at israelnewstalkradio.com.
Straight talk from Israel. You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio.
Hey, this is Jake in Anchorage, Alaska, and I love listening to all the super interesting interviews and up-to-date information on what's happening in Israel.
Hello, this is Anna King, originally from London, now living in Israel. And what can I say? Israel News Talk Radio is my cup of tea.
My name is Bhaskar. I'm from India, and I love listening because you get to know the truth and wonderful voices from this lovely country.
Mom! Okay, wait a minute. Hi, this is Chava Dax, and I'm calling from the rolling hills of Ma'ale Adumim, just north of Jerusalem. I always listen to Israel News Talk Radio to get all the latest news and commentary and to keep me up to date every day.
This is Sarah Dax from Ma'ale Adumim, and I'm 12. I wish Israel News Talk Radio was boring so my mom wouldn't listen to it all the time. Mom!
You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio.
News, opinion, and more. You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio.